Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our Agenda 2025 Education Reform session. My name is Kara Jones. I'm Director of Government Relations and Communications here at the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity. Our moderator, Ovik Roy, is running a little bit late today, but will be here soon. So I thought I'd kick us off and get the conversation started since we've only got an hour here. There's so much to talk about in the realm of education reform right now. You know, for many years, reformers have really held up this virtual learning as an opportunity to give kids extra tutoring or extracurricular options. But during COVID-19, we've seen that virtual learning has largely failed. So, we're asking the question, is virtual learning dead, or is it simply not ready for prime time? And where is the state of school reopenings, K through 12 in America? We're going to get into those topics. We're going to get into the cost of higher education and much more. So I am going to kick us off with Dan Lips. He is our visiting fellow here at FREOPP. We've got him on the line today. We also have Derrell Bradford, who is the Executive Vice President at 50 CAN. Preston Cooper, who's a visiting fellow at FREOPP working on higher education, and Lindsey Burke, Director of the Center for Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation. So thank you all to our panelists, our all-star panel today. Dan, I'm going to ask you the first question here. So what is the state of school reopenings in America right now? I know you've been following very closely the biggest 200 school districts in the nation and where they stand, whether it's some sort of hybrid, virtual, in-person learning. Where do we go from here, and what do you see the forecast for 2021?
Thanks so much for having me. We're really having this conversation at this incredible moment in the history of American education. And I think perhaps the biggest emergency that we've ever had in American education, or certainly over the past 50 years. From our work at FREOPP, we recently saw that 50 of the nation's 120 largest school districts are closed to in-person learning. And we did that analysis back in October. If you turn up the headlines every morning, it looks to me like more and more school districts are delaying their reopenings. Just today, Detroit said it was going back to remote learning. DC's pushed back its timeline for reopening. So a lot of the nation's largest school districts are going to likely be closed through the end of the year. And from the academics who have looked at the risks associated with prolonged closures, we think there could be as much as a year's worth of learning lost, particularly for disadvantaged kids who have less ability to learn outside of school. So at this unique moment in American history, we face this great long-term risk of having a generation of American kids really have their education thrown off course. And it's likely this will be grappling with this problem and helping kids remediate for decades. So the decisions that are made right now are incredibly important. And we've got a great panel today. I'd love to hear what particularly Lindsey and Derrell think on the K-12 issues that we're facing.
Lindsey, you want to go first?
Yeah, so, Dan, just bringing up Detroit just now made me think, Detroit, if you look at the academic outcomes there, we're already pre-pandemic talking about, in some cases, single-digit proficiency levels for students. And so, this notion, which I think is absolutely right, that we're unfortunately going to see a lot of these academic achievement gaps likely widened in the wake of COVID, I think is certainly the case. And the new NAEP scores came out just a couple of weeks ago, uninspiring to say the least. We see these academic achievement gaps continue. And this is not a recent issue. If we look back all the way mid-20th century to the Great Society era, a big part of the reason why the Johnson administration launched the War on Poverty was to try to mitigate these academic achievement gaps. And you can look at the work of Eric Hanushek and Paul Peterson, and they point out that at that time, around 1965, there was the equivalent of 4 grade levels worth of learning difference between children from the top and bottom deciles of the socioeconomic achievement gap. Today, it is exactly the same. We haven't seen that gap narrowed whatsoever, that there is still the difference of 4 grade levels worth of learning between children from the poorest and more affluent families in the country. And I am concerned, as we all are, about the impact not having access to in-person instruction will have. And I think the point also should be made that this is not necessarily, you asked the question about online learning, a reflection of online learning for families who have chosen pre-pandemic to go the online learning route for their children because it was the right fit for them, because for whatever reason, they weren't getting what they needed from traditional in-person instruction. What we're seeing now for the districts that are providing it is crisis online learning that unfortunately is not serving students well. So I think, 2 years from now, unfortunately, when we get new data in, new NAEP data, we're going to see that these academic achievement gaps are even wider than they were today, even wider than they were 50 or 60 years ago.
And Lindsey, why is that? Is that because more affluent families have the means to, pay for tutoring outside of the online learning classes for their kids, have the means to put together these pandemic pods that, some of the poorer families just don't have access to these resources?
So I think it's that, but I also think it's a function of more affluent families, in some cases, having already had enrolled their children in private schools pre-pandemic. And we know from the data that are out there that private schools are more likely to be open for in-person instruction than public schools are right now. So to me, all roads lead back to these problems, the root of them being that families cannot select the schools that their children attend by and large. So all roads for me always lead back to this question of education choice. And I think that's a big part of the problem that we're seeing now, that money's not nimble. It wasn't nimble pre-pandemic, and it's not nimble today for the most part. We fund systems rather than students. And until we move away from that model, we're not going to see improvement, and we're not going to be able to deal with these sorts of existential threats that might come down the road in the future.
Can I build on that a little bit, just because, like, between Dan and Lindsey, there's like 3 pitches that need to get hit for home runs right there. So I think we got to map this on like a Cartesian plane with like politics on one axis and pedagogy on the other one, right? So the first thing I just want to say is, like, so at 50CAN, we haven't really taken like a stance about reopening. What we have taken is a stance about the fact that some parents want in-person and some parents don't, right? And if you are in a position where you want in-person and your local school district isn't going to give it to you, but is wholly willing to keep the money that they would use if you were in person, like, we're not hearing that, right? So we've sort of, I think it's kind of interesting, if you're a school choice advocate, as I happen to be, we've been having this conversation for decades about the sclerotic and sort of monopolistic nature of school districts and how they routinely visit that dysfunction upon low-income kids of color. And now they're just giving that to everybody, right? So there are all kinds of people who were never in the headlights who now are having the same experience that a low-income kid in Newark in the pre-charter era, had. And so that, I think that's super interesting. The other thing I would just say is, like, again, +1 Lindsey's thing on like give me the money. Like, if I want to be in person and you're not going to let me be in person, like, give me my money, But the other important thing I think about this is that we just have to be real about how, again, on the politics piece of this, that this is massively political right now. And so to your point about continuing to extend the window of distance learning, and often, like, poorly implemented distance learning, like I think Lindsey's points about, like, the New York Times did a great piece about this. Some kids are having a great time right now, right? Like, not all kids, I want to be respectful of that. There are lots of kids who absolutely need to be in person, would benefit from being in person, whatever, but it's not bad for everybody. And I think that's really important on the innovation side. We can kind of talk about that, later as well. But what we are actually in right now is a national teacher strike. Effectively, we are in the middle of a national, the NEA and the AFT have taken America's schools hostage, and 50 million, like tens of millions of kids are having their educations ruined because the 2 big national teachers unions see this as a huge opportunity to extract once in a lifetime payments from DC, right? Just to be raw about it, right? I don't want to, so like, all of the policy conversation about reopening is actually happening in this context where it's like, yes, there are legitimate public health risks, but you're not doing these things because of public health risks. You're doing these things because Illinois wants a bailout, right? Because we want to perpetually increase the federal involvement in state education funding in ways that, you know, raises salaries, but doesn't necessarily improve quality. So I just think all that stuff is really important context for the conversation about reopening schools and the shoddy or spotty, because not everybody's doing a bad job, but the spotty implementation of distance learning across the country right now.
Yeah, thanks, Derrell. And Preston, I want to bring you in here quickly to talk about, you know, the state of reopening with America's colleges. So how are they doing on this? Do you know the data, if we've been seeing spikes since colleges have reopened for the fall? And what do we expect for the new year as the new semester starts in January?
Thanks, Kara. So we saw that for the fall 2020 semester, about 45% of colleges have decided to go either fully or primarily online, and the rest are kind of doing a hybrid model. But there's an interesting phenomenon here that I want to bring up, kind of going back to something that Lindsey said earlier about how virtual learning doesn't have to be a disaster. You know, we've seen, you know, in the schools that were in person or primarily in person before the pandemic, putting together kind of a slapdash online curriculum in a very short span of time. It hasn't gone too well for them. But we just got some new data today, which shows that enrollment at institutions that were online before the pandemic, so institutions, colleges and universities, which have been working for years at making their online offerings good, that have been working for years at investing in them, at showing students that these are good courses, those are the only schools in the country where enrollment is actually up. Undergraduate enrollment for all colleges and universities is down about 4 or 5%, but among those primarily online universities that were online before the pandemic, so Southern New Hampshire University, Western Governors University, enrollment is actually up. And I think, you know, that goes to show that we do have much more choice at the higher education level than we do at the K-12 level, where students do have, you know, the ability to choose what college they're going to go to and choose the educational model that works for them. And I think, you know, the people's preferences are being revealed here, that people are migrating away from the colleges that were all in person before the pandemic and have not done a very good job making the transition to online, and they're migrating towards schools that have been investing on online education for a long time and have really committed to making it good, and we're seeing the results there. So no, I don't think that it has to be bad, but I think that if you're going to do online education in this very hasty slapdash manner, I mean, we shouldn't be surprised with the results that we're seeing.
Thanks, Preston. And Dan, you have a new piece up on FREOPP.org about 10 questions that Congress should be asking and investigating about ongoing school closures. So, you know, there has been federal funding going to schools for their reopening efforts, and Congress has a responsibility to conduct oversight and present facts to the public. What can you tell us about what Congress needs to know about what's going on?
Sure. To Derrell's point, there's a lot of money at stake right now. There's the House Democrats have proposed $175 billion for K-12 education in their stimulus before the election. Senator McConnell and the Republicans have proposed about $100 million in new funding, $100 billion, I should say, in new funding. And this follows significant funding through the CARES Act. And at FREOPP this summer, we put together a plan that looked at some of the public health data that was then available, which led us to conclude that it was likely safe to reopen schools by giving families choice. And if their preference is to stay home, and absolutely they should do so. But with this extra funding, schools should be able to take precautions to reopen. That said, we have seen that many schools have not reopened. So my view is that Congress has an obligation to be doing a lot of oversight to understand the public health risks, to understand what tactics have have been useful in reopening, from fixing ventilation systems to deploying protective equipment, spacing out students, what have you. We need to have a really factually informed debate about how to reopen schools. and also about how to design future aid policies to help kids in need. It simply doesn't make sense to continue to dump billions of dollars into schools that are not going to be open to provide learning options. We have this incredible opportunity to use that funding in a way that's student-centered, to give children access to a once-in-a-lifetime recovery account that they could use to have tutoring, to enroll in school for the spring semester, to take summer school next year, and perhaps to continue getting tutoring over the next coming years. I think that's a debate that we need to force on Capitol Hill. Otherwise, we're just going to be pouring bad money after good to schools that are not open. But it really could be benefited by congressional oversight and fact-finding.
Yeah, I just want to plus one that I see our host is trying to pop his way in. But the one thing too that seems to have happened, Dan, is that like the school districts are basically saying it's going to cost us twice as much to give you half as much instruction now, right? And at the same time, we got to drive the buses around empty. You know, what? And you don't get to pod, but I'm sending my kid to the local Catholic school that's still open. You know, so I just think that it's almost like it's become like a race to the bottom that is like extremely protectionist in a way that chills innovation, right? Like, and I don't throw that out there as like, oh, innovation, like it's very serious time. Like there are genuine daily concerns of learning that need to be addressed. At the same time, and you guys both raised this, in 2019, I think it was 18% of African-American fourth graders read at proficient or above on the NAEP. And I'm not trying to race back to that, you know, like no one should be trying to race back to that.
Derrell, you're closer to the ground and parents' views. What do you see this as a teachable moment that we're spending $15,000 per child, and yet kids are not getting schooling? They're not even getting childcare in this case. Some school districts are actually charging for childcare at closed public school buildings.
I saw that, yeah. I don't mean to laugh. I gotta laugh to keep from crying.
Yeah.
No, so let me answer your question like a little bit differently. So to Preston said earlier about like sort of stated preference and revealed preference. So like schools give you two things. They give you childcare and they're supposed to educate your kid, right? And one of the things I think we're finding, in particular among wealthier families, is that they were actually okay with crap education. And they would spend tons of money to supplement it with museums and tutoring and all these other things. What they weren't okay with was you not watching their kid. And the moment you said you can't send your kid here, the deal was off, right? It was like Vader and Lando. It's like I've altered the deal, you know? And so like one of the sort of teachable things that's come out of this is that the constituency, I think, for school change has changed in a way that that probably would have been impossible sort of pre-pandemic, but now is possible in a very different way because lots of people have been treated poorly. And a lot of those people thought they bought their way out of poor treatment when they got a new house, right? Or when they over mortgaged themselves for an apartment to buy free school that is not really free. So that's kind of the first thing. The second thing I think is just that like what has also been revealed, I think, is that people want different things from school that they didn't know they wanted before. And it was much harder to sort of think about like, yeah, well, you know, like I think I want some tutoring in this thing, but I really want my kid to be kind, have a sort of a classical bent and be into music, right? And you couldn't stitch that child together in a traditional kind of K-12 context. And certainly when like, you know, I don't know how you feel about universal basic income or whatever, but completely in the stimulus era, the highest policy lever from DC in particular has been to just give people money, right? And so like we've built behavior that is not like the behavior we were trying to build in the, you know, in the voucher era, right? It is much closer to what Lindsey's been studying for a long time in the ESA era, right? But now it's like money appears and I'm like, I go out and do my thing. And that is unexpected. And I don't I don't think that behavior is sort of easily put away. And I think it's sort of a critical change in habits that helps like fledge a new, more interesting, more innovative approach to schooling.
Absolutely. And Lindsey, let me bring you in here, and then I'll hand it over to our moderator, Ovik Roy, has now joined us. But Lindsey, what are your thoughts on these equal access pandemic pods? And are there threats to them? What are those threats? How have we seen them working so far?
Yeah, so there are unfortunately threats that are growing. As quickly as we saw pandemic pods pop on the scene, we saw regulators pop up to try to regulate them out of existence. And this is something that we've seen in about 19 states now, where they have either established new regulations or expanded existing regulations to try to really slow the growth of these pods. My colleague Jonathan Butcher has a great report on this right now up at the State Policy Network's website. But basically what he found is there are 10 states that are trying to impose extremely draconian regulations on pods at a time when parents need flexibility and access more than they have ever needed it before. And I would give one example. Illinois is a good, bad example of a state trying to push pods out of the marketplace. They are trying to classify pods as daycare centers. And there are about 10 states that are trying to do this. And what that means for families and for innovation is that they basically have to go, and the states want them to get a daycare license to operate a pandemic pod. And that could mean 15 hours of childcare coursework. It could mean demonstrating that your college coursework was aligned with early childhood development, fingerprinting, background checks, all kinds of things that will really dampen the innovation that we're seeing right now underway with pods across the country, which are organic, and they are just civil society in action in response to this pandemic, which has really been amazing to see. And I would say on your earlier question too about equal access to pods, they are, I will admit, the prices are all over the place. If you want to find a really posh pandemic pod, it is out there. Town and Country magazine, which I love, but they had a big spread on how pandemic pods are going to exacerbate educational inequality with families getting private tutoring behind privet hedges. But yes, there are going to be those $25,000 pods in Manhattan, but that is the exception and not the norm. What we're seeing are extremely affordable pod options. Sometimes the price is even zero for these pods. We see families who are providing lunches as their contribution, providing content matter expertise to be part of that pod. So instead of a financial contribution, they're providing some other form of payment to the pod. And so we're seeing that. But I think what is really important too is what Derrell mentioned a minute ago, this idea of ESAs, which really originated largely in Dan Lips's head. So we will give credit to Dan for the ESA concept, which is now in operation in 5 states. And we're seeing more and more states move in that direction. But it's as if, Dan, you thought about ESAs as the perfect policy pairing for pandemic pods. It's as if they were made for the moment that we are in, because you can use, as everybody knows, your ESA to pay for individual services and products and providers. So you can pay that teacher directly with your ESA. You can hire a private tutor. You can purchase online learning. I mean, it is really and truly just the policy that could have not been better thought of for the moment that we're in for families to finance these pods. And in states that have them, many of the states do put income contingencies on access to those pods. They're means tested. So that means low-income students are using them. Students with special needs, in the case of Arizona, are the largest category of students using them. And we're already seeing quite a few instances of families in Arizona who are using their ESA to pay for their pods. And so it's really been exciting to see, and I think answers a lot of this question of equality of access to podding that we want everybody to have.
Can I just one quick thing on this? Because I know that in 4 years or whatever, you would love to have somebody take up an agenda that was informed by this conversation that wasn't political suicide, right? So one of the things so you got to think about teachers and all this too. And I think the interesting thing that people don't talk about is that the podding moment, right? And Lindsey, I loved how alliteratively you described Dan Lips's pandemic pod idea, the ESA idea. There is an opportunity here to develop a different market for how teachers are paid as well, which is totally under the radar. So like right now, you teach in your traditional district school, and like this is a little flip, but it's not entirely flip, and the result doesn't matter. And you get paid based on the result not mattering, right? And you work somebody else's hours, and you were in a traditional K-12 context. And now there's the opportunity to work for a family or a smaller group of families who want a relationship with you as the instructor for their child, right? Who want you to develop a plan of instruction for their children that is something you are excited about and something their kids are excited about. And you can get paid for that, right? And that's an environment where only the result matters. And so I think there's just a huge opportunity for teachers to have like a more diverse approach, right? Like many other ways to execute on their craft, and like contradictory to what I think a lot of people would want to do, which is just regulate pods into the blob, right? This is a chance to like break out and give you all the freedoms that you don't get from your current professional arrangement.
And the Wall Street Journal had a good piece on that, where there's some teachers, anecdotally so far, admittedly, but who are earning more teaching to pods than they were the whole year prior teaching in their traditional school arrangement. So it could certainly benefit long teachers. The earning potential, the sky's the limit for teachers, I think, ultimately, if every single kid's walking around with a $14,000 ESA in their pocket.
Let me jump in here, and I thanks all for all of you for bearing with my Zoom issues this afternoon, and build on that for a 2025 related question, which is what do we see as the possibility for micro schools, pods, to become more of the answer as we go along here? Derrell, you mentioned the effort to regulate them into the blob. There's a possibility of using education savings accounts. Now, particularly with the Supreme Court case, there's a lot more, it seems to me, legal and statutory room to use ESAs. Do we see this? Is this something that has the potential to, or is already becoming a movement from a long-term standpoint? Presumably, at some point, we'll be past COVID. Does the pod movement continue past COVID?
Yeah, go ahead, Lindsay. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, I think this is the big question right now, is how permanent is all of this? So EdChoice has a new survey out, nationally representative survey. They find that 35% of parents say that they're currently in a pod. Another 18% say that they're looking to join a pod. And 70% of teachers in their survey said that they were interested in teaching to a pod. And so I think that all portends very good news for podding long term. At the same time, though, Mike McShane just had a piece out today where he points out that, yeah, 35% of families saying they're in pods, but 85% of those families are using them to supplement district school instruction. Yeah. So, I think we have to have modest expectations about how much this will long-term really upend the way that we deliver content. But, even if it is 6%, 8% of families who long-term decide to pod as their permanent solution, that's double the numbers of families who currently homeschool. And I do think that that's a sea change.
Yeah, and I would just say on that too, like the size of the market matters, in particular because the margins for school districts are so small. So like they're not built to adjust to changes in population, which is why even though tens of thousands of kids are going missing, school districts are still saying, pay us based on last year's enrollment, right? And so to the extent that even a small amount of parents decide to pod, the economic impact is disproportionate, I think. And so the competitive impact could also be disproportionate. That also said, Lindsay, I think the important thing about like whether or not it sticks is scale. So like, despite what the federal election, what the presidential election may portend, state elections seem to have sent signals that the world is like a little more interested in talking this through than the New York Times might have you believe.
I'd like to just add one point on that. In addition to the growth and the future of pods, one issue that I think we're going to have to grapple with is remediation and tutoring. And so while we may not get to this world of ESAs following children to an education service provider of their choice, like many of us would want to, I think we are going to have to grapple with how are we going to provide tutoring or remediation services, particularly to the kids who've fallen way behind, whose educations have been ruined, as Derrell said. So I think a big question there is, are we going to see customized solutions like the Florida Reading ESA scholarship tool, or are we going to see some, after school classes at the school district that hasn't taught them during the day? And so to me, that could be the real challenge and opportunity to begin to give parents more choice and give kids some better options.
Yeah, there is actually a policy window on that. Even so, I was like, there are a lot of people on the political left who actually are supportive of this idea of like national tutoring corps, and I think in England they did this. It was like, I mean, there are some international examples of it. I'm not saying you should limit it to that, but like short term, that is an application that of ESA plus teacher market and intervention on remediation, Dan, that could get some bipartisan support behind it.
So then go ahead, Dan. So the other piece of this that's interesting, of course, is the virtual piece. We've talked about a little bit the failure of virtual, the fact that it was kind of rushed. Are there things that we can learn from that from a 2025 standpoint? If we want to use virtual as a supplement or an alternative to the existing paradigm, where's the place to use it? And maybe some of that is also on the higher ed side, but let's stick with K through 12 for now, and then we can get to the higher ed stuff where obviously virtual is already a big part of the process.
So just a couple of quick thoughts on that. We know that immediately after the pandemic, only about 1/3 of districts were really implementing virtual instruction with any level of fidelity whatsoever. Actually doing instruction online, tracking how students were doing, even things like keeping attendance. DC wasn't keeping attendance, wasn't tracking student grades. And so, who knows at this point if that's gotten any better or not, but I think districts really did a poor job at rolling this out. And then they had 5 months or so to get it right before the fall semester hit, and then still largely didn't get it right there either. So hopefully there are some things that we can learn from that. I do think from just the student perspective, particularly with young children, one thing that we have heard the districts that are doing it really well reiterate over and over again is you don't just try to replicate normal in-person district experience online. So don't, sit the 7-year-old down for an hour-long Zoom conversation. You want to have those short little sound bites. And so, I think moving away from how we've traditionally thought about the delivery of content is going to be really important for virtual to actually work well moving forward. And then remembering, and I keep driving home this point, but that it's a very different thing for families who have selected into online learning as something that works well for their kid and that they've chosen through their own volition versus being thrown into a crisis online learning model because of the pandemic.
Yeah, and there are some districts like Phoenix Union has done a good job, whatever. So there are some districts, I don't want to throw them all out, but I think it's really important to note, and Bellwether's done some stuff on this too, that the schools that have responded the best to having to put together a serious distance learning option are charter schools, because they have charter-like freedoms, right, which we should not roll back, and private schools, because they have the same freedoms plus more market pressure. Right, so that is an important thing to note. The other thing I would just say about and Lindsey's point about like you want families who want to be in a distance option to decide to be in it, like that. That's also important. To me, the important thing about this though is that some people have just done a good job and some people haven't, and that's because some people are better at it than other people. And so to me, this is one of those opportunities. If you're like an educational freedom person, like, why is it that if I'm enrolling in a school that is not a physical place, you got me going online to the school I would normally go to, right? There's no reason why somebody who has a really awesome distance learning option, no matter where they are, should not be able to enroll me. So like, if I'm in Cali and I want to wake up early and I want to go to Success Virtual in New York, I should be able to do that. And so to me, that is like one of I mean, it's probably a higher ed paradigm, here. That's one of the best things that's a mind shift we should be talking about like where you get learning's everywhere. You could learn everywhere, right? This crosses all kinds of boundaries, geographic boundaries, state boundaries, right? Like I think that's an idea we should be promoting in the K-12 context, especially given the fact, the world's a strange place right now. Like we got hurricanes and pandemics and you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. This is a better way to be ready for it.
Which also addresses the question of scale as well. So, it came up earlier, but this question of scalability for things like pods, marrying that with options that are out there like Success Academy, really marrying that like Prinda has done with the charter model is the way that we ultimately get to scalability.
Preston.
Yes, I want to go off of something that Derrell said because, we do see in higher ed, less than 10% of students before COVID were doing their programs entirely online, but 35 to 40% of students were taking at least one of their classes online. And the reason for this is, if you're not constrained physically, if your college is not offering a particular kind of course, a particular math course or chemistry course, or who knows, or some course that you want to take and that's not available at your college, you can take that somewhere else. And I think that's really, when we talk about the future of online learning in higher ed, that's what it's going to be, more than necessarily people doing their entire program online, but combining a brick and mortar component with, being able to have a much broader array of classes available to you, because you can take online classes at a school that's across the country and at a school that might be doing that class that you're interested in much better than the school that you're enrolled in. And it really does. It does open up choice and options to students and allows them to squeeze more value out of their education. I would say, the one red flag I would raise is that we have seen, especially in the online space at higher education, that the promised kind of cost savings have not necessarily materialized. That we thought, if we can enroll thousands of students in a massive open online course, that'll dramatically reduce the cost of higher education. That really has not materialized so much. And I think that kind of points to the fact that even though online instruction is kind of delivering education in a new format, online instruction is still facing kind of the same incentives as in-person instruction, in which case, their incentive is to maximize the amount of revenue that they can take in, and the colleges are still going to do that, whether they're providing the education online or in person. So I would say that that's the next thing to work on is changing the incentives so that schools do have an incentive to lower their costs and make the education get you more bang for your buck. Online education is a promising channel to lower costs, but unless we create the incentives to do that, the promised cost savings are not going to materialize.
Well, Preston, I want to build off the optimistic point you made, not the pessimistic one. And the optimistic point was, hey, if we have this disaggregated system, so much of our thinking about education reform traditionally, as you all know, has been about the institution, school choice as opposed to educational choice, right? And to me, the dream scenario is you have a kid who likes his school maybe because he's with his neighbors and his friends and isn't having to go all the way across town. But there's one class where he needs some extra instruction, or maybe he's like a math genius, but his school doesn't have algebra 2 or doesn't have the quality of instruction he needs to accelerate where he or she is. To me, isn't that the real game changer in all this, that you can actually take students and say they can take a language, or they could take a math class, or they can have a better teacher where the teacher that they have is not serving that student well?
Yeah, Vivek, I think that's exactly right. If it can really enhance the student's educational experience if they do can have a shopping cart experience and be able to take different courses at different places and be able to shop around, not just for the school that might work best for them, but for the course that might work best for them. Because we know right now that most students who are graduating high school are not going to apply to that many colleges, just because of the distance constraints and the time constraints of submitting so many applications, the cost constraints of the application fees. Most students are only going to end up applying to 1 to 3 colleges, which really constrains the amount of options they can consider, and really also constrains the competitive pressures on the colleges. But if we move to a world where students can take courses not just within their own 50-mile radius of their hometown, but they can take a course at a college that's across the country. Maybe that course is not offered at the school they're attending, or maybe that course is offered in a much better way, maybe by a much better professor or in a much more appealing format, you know, at a school that's across the country or somewhere completely different from where the student is physically located. I mean, that's where, you know, we can start bringing those competitive pressures to bear, where we're giving students more options, not just about the school that they're choosing, but also about the course catalog that they're selecting. And so I'm optimistic in the future that that will produce some pressures that will really benefit students.
It's just one quick thing on what
please.
Preston said. So when I went to college back in the Pleistocene, like one of the things that, you know, like I heard this the first day I got on campus. They were like, I didn't even know what the class was. Somebody said, that professor is amazing, you should take that class, right? And lots of people shop for the professor. And so I do think there is this other thing, because this is a K-12 thing too, right? Is that instead of having the physical location of the school, right, or the sort of dogma of the course course selection dictate what you're taking, you can have the best professor anywhere, right? And I think that's just a different kind of pressure. It would probably reorganize, hopefully in a better way, K-12 in this fashion that's like where you have like really excellent professors and lots of graduate assistants, right? In the K-12 context, you have the person in America who is best at teaching reading comprehension, and then like 1,000 other people who are sort of doing the supplemental stuff or, you know, whatever, which is also hard, but also very different. It might be good to move to that model, like your shopping cart thing. I think is a good analogy, sort of a la carte, high end, you know, whatever. So we'll see.
What you know, in the time that we have left, I'd love to take this conversation and say, look, what are the things that you think could realistically happen over the next 4 years, or that we could get to a point where we could achieve in the next 4 years that aren't on people's radar today? Or is that wishful thinking? And maybe it's more about incremental gains, given all the resistance to change that's out there. From a 2025 standpoint, when somebody is running for president in 2024 and hopefully being inaugurated in 2025, what are the kinds of educational reforms we should be talking about then?
I'll take a crack at that. I think that I think we should start that conversation by looking at the problems which are becoming increasingly apparent by the day. Before the pandemic at FREOPP, we were studying, you know, what are the barriers to equal opportunity, and two of the biggest ones we found were, you know, residential assignment and the limits of putting kids in schools just based on their zip code. That was wrong before the pandemic, and as Derrell pointed out, it's crazy today now that the schools are closed. But that will be a continuing barrier to educational opportunity for kids who can't attend a school of their parents' choice. The second is this vast inequality in outside of school learning options. That's been ripped open by the pandemic. We know that rich families spend $9,000 per year on their kid. Poor families spend $1,000 or less. That's getting at this vast learning that happens outside of the classroom. I think now the pandemic is forcing us to think about schooling beyond the brick walls, beyond September to June. It's forcing us to think about education in a whole new way. And I'm actually pretty optimistic that this conversation coming out of pandemic recovery could move in the direction of figuring out how to help kids recover their education in a way that suits them. And that's going to require thinking beyond the schoolhouse, beyond residential assignment, and more about letting them pursue educational learning on their own timeline over the next 4 years. So I'm optimistic.
Yeah, I would second the residential assignment piece, and it might sound incremental on the surface, but I do think it's incremental in a way, but it's a way there should be bipartisan support behind that could lead to a much more profound change if it were achieved in a given state. And so, you know, I would say, look, we've got district boundaries right now, but within those districts, and Derrell has a great video out on this right now that does this much better justice than I'm about to do it. But within these school districts, you have attendance zone boundaries that, and Derrell can talk about this too, overlay, unfortunately, pretty nicely on 1930s era segregationist maps created by the federal government as part of their housing redlining policies. Just so happens school district boundaries today are almost a one-to-one match with those old redlined maps. And it should keep us up at night that that is still the case and kids are still assigned to schools based on those zones. And so that's within a district. States, I would say, could step right in and tell school districts that they are not allowed to have those attendance zone boundaries within districts and allow for actual public school choice within those school districts. And I think that is both somewhat incremental because it's public school choice, but really, like I said, gets to a profound change that needs to happen in the way we think about access that kids have to certain schools within their neighborhoods and outside of their neighborhoods.
I like that. I mean, it has broader impacts besides schools, right? If people
Yeah.
are able to interact with each other outside of their little neighborhood. Go ahead, Drew.
No. So for this enterprising candidate who wants to bring us together around educational freedom in 4.5 years, two quick things, because the second one I'm just going to build on what Lindsey and Dan said. The first one is that they should add reform, right? Education policy change is a suite of policy tools that you use to solve problems for people. And so to me, that person needs to lead with the fact that the tools help you solve the problems that American people are facing. So it's to some extent, it could be reclaiming your education after the disruption, but it could also be the pursuit of human dignity, like a place in the community, right? Like a better civic engagement with who we are as Americans, right? There are lots of things that people value that the tools of reform can help us get back in touch with. And I would hope that whoever this person is would want to unite around that mission, which is like a values mission that the tools ladder up to, instead of, we love these tools, let's see what happens. That's kind of the first thing. The second thing I would say, and I think Lindsey's right on about this, the residential assignment thing, all that stuff notwithstanding, there's two ways to look about it. You look at it, you can either take a zero-sum approach and say, the line is here because everything outside of it is good and everything inside of it is bad. And so we're gonna divide up what's outside of it, right? Or you can say, the line has us in a framework of scarcity, where we think that we will only ever create the good schools that currently exist and everything else will be bad. And we know that's not true, right? And pandemic pods, micro schools, charter schools, existing, non-public schools, like there are other engines of education creation, right? Like they aren't even just making new schools, right? They're making new, like to this point, they're making new education, new modes to interact with it and to organize it and to get it. And we should be thinking about applying that ingenuity, right? Like that energy to the problem of underperforming schools and like its roots in racist policy in particular that come out of redlining and residential assignment. So I would hope that somebody would want to take that on in a way that it's like we can do more. Like we can raise all boats for all kids in a very productive way.
It's Jay Green's thing, right? Fix schools by not fixing schools. I mean, I think the work outside of the existing system is where we're going to see some real long-term change.
I mean, that's what charter schools, and essentially that's why they've succeeded, right? Because they weren't as much of a threat as to saying, hey, we're going to have you go to a private school or have the low-income kid go to the upper middle class public school, where those upper middle class people say, hey, I'm paying the property taxes for this school, and
you need to say that louder for the people in the back.
Well, the thing, Derrell, about it that I find so fascinating, from my seat is that it's the fact that the conservative side of the debate has taken on this question of school choice is so interesting because basically it's massive wealth redistribution, right? You're taking the property taxes, what we're advocating for, all of us who are on this call, we're advocating for taking that high property tax person saying, you know what, some of your property taxes are going to subsidize the cost of educating low-income kids. And from my standpoint, I'm like, why don't we take that argument and broaden it out and talk about that with a lot of other things, and say redistribution of wealth at some levels okay.
And look at the reverse incentives of this. Look, dude, I rent, man. All right, I'm a renter, okay. But like, why is there so much consternation around salt? right? It's because
Right.
we're offsetting what you pay in property to get a private school that is publicly funded, right? And nobody, like, let's take it on. It's unfair. It's totally unfair. Let's take it on.
Well, speaking of redistribution of wealth, Preston, one of the things that we hear Bernie Sanders talk about is free college, which is basically a massive transfer of wealth from lower income Americans to the upper income Americans who go to college, the 1/3 of the Americans who do. Having said that, the rising cost of college is obviously a massive problem. It's the single largest source of consumer debt, short of home mortgages. It's getting worse every year. It seems like a whole generation of kids or millennials, not kids anymore, are facing this enormous economic pressure because of the interest costs of their education. What can we do to reduce the inflation in higher ed and post-secondary education?
Well, I think it goes right back to the incentives that right now, basically we have the incentives set up such that the federal government is sending money to colleges with basically zero accountability on whether students are getting value out of that education. I think until you fix that, until you say, taxpayers are going to stop funding schools where people are taking on tons of debt, dropping out and defaulting and not getting good middle class jobs, I think we're going to continue to see the cost of college rise because that's the incentive we've set up. And I also want to go back to something that Dan said, which is relevant to this about learning, outside the classroom, because at the higher education level, we do have a little bit more choice than we do at the K-12 level. I mean, you can take your Pell Grant, you can go to whatever accredited school you want, but we're still talking about a school. We're still talking about that the federal government is funding almost exclusively traditional kinds of higher education, but there's a lot of learning opportunities out there at the post-secondary level that are not traditional schools. There's apprenticeships, there's internships, there's work experience, and I think part of controlling the cost of college has to deal with leveling the playing field there and making sure that students have other options that can either complement a traditional education or in some places can replace a traditional education. And if we introduce that, if we introduce those alternatives, I think that students, will have a lot more options, and that will put more pressure on, the traditional colleges who are getting all the money now to try and reduce their costs.
We've talked, and this will be one of the last questions I throw at you. We've talked a bit, particularly on the opening side with the COVID-19 school closures, around the power of the unions to keep schools closed. It seems to me that's a very striking example of how powerful the unions are, right? Like the fact that you could keep schools closed, even though the case for reopening them is so strong, tells you that their power is immense. And so for a lot of the things that we're talking about, getting more policymaker traction for them is limited by the fact that often unions are opposed to these reforms. So what is the solution for that? What is the way to, whether it's to persuade the unions that some of these reforms are not threats to them, or maybe it's to work around the unions by getting some of the teachers themselves to be advocates? What's the way to deal with that institutional political economy challenge?
Yeah, and I guess I'm supposed to step on that landmine. So look, like you could solve it tomorrow with $1 trillion, right? I mean, like that's probably the cost to entry, And I'm unsure that like some legitimate, right? PPE, cleaning, all this stuff, like these things are legitimate, right? So I'm being flipped, but I don't want to be 100% flipped. But a lot of it really is like it's a big cash grab, right? It just is, And so to me, and here's where I'm gonna reel it, my horns are really gonna come out. There are America's teaching force right now, not its individual teachers, but as organized by its unions, right, are the 1%. They are the 1% of the working economy that the 99% that everybody else is being responsive to. And and that has enormous impact, particularly if you are not part of the managerial elite and cannot work from home. And so to me, like the deals or no deals are only actually achieved when that revelation is internalized by lots of people who have not normally internalized it. Now, the one piece of this I will just say is that, like, in the communities I've sort of worked in and advocated for a lot, like, as much as people make common cause with their teacher, because like your teacher's like your legislator, like Congress sucks, but my congressman's great. Like, there are lots of people who are now being confronted by this self-interest in ways that I think will lead to this revelation. So Dan made this point earlier about, I'd be picking on Northern Virginia all the time. It's like, you cannot send your child here, but we will watch your child if you pay for it, right? That changes the relationship between teachers unions, school districts, school leaderships, and parents in a way that is not easily undone. And I do believe that, like, though the opportunity for political spoils is enormous, particularly, you know, if Georgia's elections go another way, I don't think that this bell will get unrung easily, particularly if schools aren't more responsive in the very short term, like much sooner rather than later.
Yeah. So to summarize your point, it's basically, if the micro school, I don't want to call it a revolution, let's call it a rebellion, is something that gets more traction, more sovereignty for the dollars. The education dollars are being controlled by families rather than by institutions. Then that is the kind of camel's nose under the tent that can help create more independence for innovation.
That's you said that much better than I said.
Oh, I definitely did not. Anyone else? Final thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I couldn't say it better than Derrell just said it, but we have a huge opportunity right now. You know, the unions are going to try to stand in the way of that. We've seen that in state after state and district after district, and try to stand in the way of that opportunity based on things that have zero to do with education as well, things like Medicare for all that are way outside of the education policy realm. So they're going to continue to try to hold on to the power that they have accumulated over the past 100 years. But I really do think we have a chance right now in decoupling the delivery to really move that power out of the special interest hands and out of the hands of Washington and government policymakers generally, and into the hands of families.
Great. Well, with that, let's conclude this session. Thank you all for sparing the time today, and again, bearing with my Zoom challenges. You've been watching the education panel of Agenda 2025, FREOPP's conference on the agenda for the president, who was inaugurated in 2025 with the goal of building that equal opportunity agenda that both sides, both parties, all Americans can get behind. Tomorrow, we'll be back at the same time, 3:30 Eastern, 12:30 Pacific, same Zoom URL link. On healthcare, we're going to talk about the Fair Care Act, a new bill introduced by Mike Braun in the Senate and Bruce Westerman in the House that strives to achieve universal health insurance through private coverage. And then we'll be back again next week, Tuesday through Friday, for the final sessions of Agenda 2025. If you want to see more on the schedule, go to agenda.freopp.org. I'm Ovik Roy. Thank you so much for joining us.